Well, hello there. I didn't see you come in. Make yourself at home. Have a drink. While I give some attention to some underappreciated characters and storylines that I personally love. And I hope you grow to love as well.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back. Today we are reading Swamp Thing number 138. And just a little catch up on what's been going on in the last couple issues. We are coming to a close on Nancy Collins' run with this issue. Normally I give a little bit of warning on that, but I think I was just too involved in the story because each issue was following the other so closely. And even I didn't realize that the ending was coming up so quickly. So this is the last official issue of Nancy Collins' run on Swamp Thing. Then I believe there's a fill-in issue, and then a new creative team starts with issue 140. But let's get back to this issue. So in the last couple issues, we've been following Swamp Thing and Abby and their journeys as they separate and end their marriage and relationship. But unfortunately, in the background, Anton Arcane has come back to life, and he has kidnapped Abby. And in the last issue, we saw Swamp Thing come to the laboratory that he's keeping her at, along with his daughter Tefe, because that is actually what Anton Arcane wants. And once he made sure that Abby was alive, he made a deal with Anton that he would let Tefe build Anton a new body if Abby was given back to him unharmed. And that is what happened. Tefe walked forward, built Anton a new body, and the last issue ended with Abby walking over to Swamp Thing as she was being released, and she was saying, "Don't look at me," and as he raised the veil on her face, it was revealed that Anton had done something to her that seemed to mutate half of her body, so she kind of looks like Two-Face right now. And that is exactly where we're picking up in issue 138. But first things first, we see the cover here. A light is shining down through the trees on Swamp Thing as he calmly stands and is walking out of the water. And then behind him, on either side of the light beam, there is Tefe and Lady Jane, and on the other side is Abby, and she is looking like she's hiding something because you can only see half of her face. And we also see that this issue is written by Nancy Collins with art by Scott Eaton and Kim DeMulder. And like I said, we start off on the first page exactly where we left off on the last page, with Abby yelling, "Please don't look at me," and Anton laughing and Swamp Thing looking shocked. And as Anton stops laughing, he looks at Swamp Thing and says, "You know what they say, Holland. Beauty may only be skin deep, but ugly goes clean to the bone." And a very angry Swamp Thing turns around and punches Anton Arcane in the face, and he yells, "Bastard!" And then he raises his fist again, and we see his hand has definitely grown spikes, and it looks like it's going to do a lot of damage to Anton's new body. And Swamp Thing raises his fist again, and he says, "You evil, stinking bastard!" And then he swings again, and we see Anton stop his hand in mid-swing, and then Anton says, "You forget. You're not dealing with a frail old man or a twisted freak this time, Holland. This body is young and virile and supernaturally strong." And as he says that last line, as he holds on to Swamp Thing's hand, he brings the other arm down across the elbow, and it actually breaks Swamp Thing's arm off. And Swamp Thing cries out, I guess in pain, and then Anton yells, "Attack, my unmen! Do as you like with the others, but save the child for me!" Then all of the unmen who are in the room turn and begin to walk towards the group of people that are with Tefe, and that group is consisted of Lady Jane, John Constantine, and John's friend Dawn. And as a particularly large unman walks towards John, he says, "Shit." And then he decides to make the first move, so he jumps forward and sticks his thumb in the unman's eye, and as the unman cries out in pain, John says, "Clear off, arsehole, or I'll rip off what passes for your face and shove it down your bleeding gullet." In the meantime, Lady Jane begins to use her plant powers to wrap a couple of them up with vines, and then one of them even goes for Tefe. And this was kind of a funny moment because you get to see how much Tefe has grown in powers and maturity since she transformed and came back from Free Country and the Children's Crusade story arc. So as an unman approaches her, she says, "Bad monster, go away." And then the unman dissolves in front of her, like she makes his skin and everything just completely disappear. Then we focus on Dawn for a panel, and Dawn was actually smart. He brought a gun to this monster fight, so he begins shooting and he actually kills the unman that's coming after him, and he says, "Jesus!" And then he sees an unman grab Abby and begin to take off with her, and he yells out, "Abby!" And then he runs over and he literally puts the gun to the unman's head and fires, so I guess he kills that unman because he shoots him in the brain. And as he does that, he yells out, "Get away from her, damn you!" And Abby had fallen to the floor during this scuffle, and as Dawn bends down to help her up, he says, "Are you all right?" And as of right now, I think Swamp Thing is the only one who's actually seen her face the way that Anton has mutated it. And as he bends down, we can only see the good side of her face, or the not mutated side. And she's tearing up as she says, "Don't look, it's horrible." And then Dawn actually pulls her closer, and he brushes aside the veil in her hair, and he sees the horrible mutation that Anton has done to her face, but he doesn't care. He's not fazed at all, and he even begins to cry and tear up and says, "Oh God, Abby, it doesn't matter. As long as you're alive, nothing else matters." And Abby, of course, is kind of stunned, but very happy about this. And she smiles and says, "You really mean that, don't you?" And Dawn replies, "Of course I do. This is hardly the time or place for a polite lie." And right as he says that, an unman grabs him and begins to pull him back from her, and the gun falls out of his hand because he's surprised by this. So the unman was standing behind Dawn, and then he grabbed him. So the head of the unman is at the same level as the head of Dawn. And as his gun falls, Abby picks it up and she takes aim and she says, "Put him down, you piece of shit!" And then she fires, and the bullet hits the unman right between the eyes, killing it instantly. And as it falls dead to the ground, Abby runs over to Dawn and gives him a big hug and gives him back the gun. Then we cut to Connie Sunderland, who, in all the commotion, has been completely forgotten by either side, and she was actually able to take the head of the corpse of Sunderland and walk out of there as the fight began. So she's walking through some other lab hallways that say, "Warning, restricted, authorized personnel only," and she's talking to the skull of Sunderland in her hands, and she's saying, "Daddy, it's not fair. I worked so hard, so very, very hard. I made myself into the son you always wanted, handled everything the way I knew you would have it done, so you would be proud of me when you came back." And as she walks down this restricted hallway, an automated voice begins saying, "Warning, warning, you are entering a secured area. Identify yourself or risk termination." But Connie's not really paying attention to this. She's thinking about her dad when she thought he was alive and touching her face and realizing that it was all a trick and it was just an imposter. Then the automated voice says again, "Repeat, identify yourself or risk termination." And as Connie walks over to a panel on the wall, she puts her hand up to it, and as she does, she says, "But I'll show them. I'll show them all." And this is like an identity confirmation panel, so she presses her hand into it, it reads her hand and says, "Clearance confirmed for Sunderland, Constance." And now that she's authorized, she gives a command saying, "Computer, activate code Mishima." And the computer replies, "Code Mishima now keyed in sequence. Thank you. Have a nice day. Self-destruct will occur in T-minus 10 minutes and counting." And then she picks up General Sunderland's corpse head and then begins to run down one of the hallways. And as she's about to round a corner, she sees a shadow of someone and she assumes it's Dr. Polygon. And she yells out, "Get out of my way, Polygon. I've no time for your babbling." But the shadow doesn't move, and then as she rounds the corner, she yells again, "I said, get out of my way!" But as she turns the corner, she is confronted by not Polygon, but another unmanned creation of Dr. Anton Arcane, and this kind of looks like a spiky alligator who stands on two legs, and it also has like a human head in its chest. And Connie even looks at it questioningly and says, "Polygon?" And the monster reaches out to attack her, saying, "Pretty." Then we cut to Swamp Thing and Dr. Arcane, and they are fighting still. And it definitely looks like Anton's new body is a match for Swamp Thing and vice versa, because Swamp Thing's face is all puffy and bruised, and Anton has a bunch of spikes that have, broken off of Swamp Thing that are sticking in his head and arms, and even part of his new cheek is sliced open, and you can see his back teeth through the cut. And currently they're both standing, but Swamp Thing has Anton by the neck and seems to be trying to strangle him. "Give up, Holland!" And Swamp Thing answers, "Never." And then Anton is able to take one of his arms and break Swamp Thing's grip around his neck, and then he smiles and says, "You can never hope to defeat me, you pathetic compost heap. What is the best you can do? Kill me? Ha! When's the last time that worked?" And then he swings and punches Swamp Thing in the face, and as Swamp Thing recovers from that, he says, "I'm going to send you back to hell, even if I have to drag you there myself." And as Swamp Thing grabs at Anton again, Anton smiles and says, "We'll see about that." And then Swamp Thing freezes as if something's wrong, and he looks at Anton and says, "What? Feels like something is inside me. something buzzing and swarming, feeding on me like insects. And as he says insects, his insides and everything burst apart, and we get a really cool panel of pretty much like a skeleton underneath all his flesh as his flesh explodes and millions of insects fly out of his body. And as Swamp Thing's bones fall to the ground in a steaming pile, Anton begins to laugh and says, "Ha ha ha ha! I win! After all these years, I win!" But then something happens and he falls down in pain saying, "Ah!" And then he looks down at his hands and it seems like something's going on with them and he says, "What's happening to me? Suddenly I feel so weak. I'm growing old again. How can this be?" And then he looks around and he sees Tefe standing right next to him, and she is looking pretty serious, and he points at her and says, This is your doing, you wretched little brat." And as his once muscular body begins to shrivel and get old, he says, Stop it right now." And then Tefe just turns around and puts her back to him and says, "Don't wanna." And even though Anton's in pain, he tries to struggle to move towards her, and he says, "I'll have your eyes for marbles, you little ugh." And then he falls to the ground in pain and he yells out, What are you doing to me? Ah!" And then all of a sudden, as he screams out in pain, we see plants growing out of every orifice of his body, and then his stomach bursts open from a ball of vines that was growing in his stomach, and then we see all the vines and plants grow into one being, and that is Swamp Thing. And he is now back to his original body, the one he looked like for most of this run. And if you remember when the folk people brought him back and he had to grow his like 90s grunge body, they did say, it will wear off. You won't always look like this. And when your power has regenerated enough, you'll be able to grow your body back the way it was. And we can see underneath Swamp Thing's newly grown body is Anton Arcane's body, and it's like torn apart. You can see the limbs are facing opposite ways they should be, and his torso is very far away from his knees and legs. And Don saw this and he says, "I gotta hand it to the big cabbage. He knows how to make an entrance." But it's not over that easy, of course. And we see from the body of Anton Arcane, a red mist begins to appear, and then it comes together and forms a giant apparition of a monstrous Anton Arcane. And this apparition kind of looks like he has a crab body, but with Anton Arcane's head. And Anton looks down at Swamp Thing and says, "Are you such a fool that you think by simply destroying my host body, you defeated me as well? You'll never be rid of me, Holland. Never!" And then Anton looks down at Swamp Thing and all the people with him, and then he focuses on John Constantine and he says, "This one should do very nicely." And then the red mist begins to go around John Constantine and he says, "Sod off, you bug-eyed wanker." But apparently John can't really do anything to block this, and Anton ends up possessing him. And we see John's eyes turn white, but he just stands still, and we see the red mist kind of push out of him a little bit, and then that red mist says, "This one is stronger than I expected. He's fighting me." And as he struggles, out of nowhere comes a piece of barbed wire, and it wraps around the neck of John Constantine. But not actually the neck of John Constantine, it wraps around the spirit of Anton Arcane inside of him. And if you don't remember what this is actually a callback from issue 125, where the demons known as Agony and Ecstasy were trying to track down Anton after he escaped from hell. And they were unable to find them because he hid himself in General Sunderland's body. But now that he's been exposed, I guess, they have found him. And if you don't remember what Agony and Ecstasy look like, basically they're human bodies of a man and a woman that are all white and they're naked. And then they are wrapped and bound together, like intertwining their limbs and stuff, with barbed wire. And when they speak, they shift positions through the barbed wire. So I guess as they talk, like if the man is talking, he moves up and the barbed wire like tears into their flesh. But I think they're also supposed to be like making love at the same time. And that's why they're called Agony and Ecstasy, because you have the pain and the pleasure at the same time. So as a piece of their barbed wire comes down and pulls Anton Arcane's spirit out, he yells out, "No, not them, not now, no!" And then like a tiny version of his spirit appears between their faces, and the male demon in the duo says, "We were correct. We knew if we were patient and waited long enough, the escaped demon known as Arcane would be forced to use its powers, thereby making it visible to us." Then they bind Anton's spirit in barbed wire, so they're actually just holding the barbed wire with one of their hands, and like a little tiny version of Anton's face is bound in barbed wire hanging from that. And then the male demon turns to Swamp Thing and says, "We thank you, friend Bogatir, for enabling us to locate our quarry." And then John, who's like recovering from the possession, is rubbing his neck and he says, "I helped too, you know." And then the female looks at John and says, "Oh yes, the trickster mage. We have a message for you from the fallen. He says he will soon see you in hell. If not his, then one of your own making." And John looks at them and replies, "Oh yeah? Well, you can tell the old boy he can kiss my rosy red arse." And then the demons open up a vortex and they begin to go through it. And Anton's head is kind of trailing behind them on the barbed wire. And before he goes through, he yells out, "Don't think this is over, Holland. It's never over. Never. I'll be back. Even if I have to overthrow Satan himself, I'll be back. I will return." And then his head goes through the vortex and the vortex closes. And then John lights a cigarette and says to Swamp Thing next to him, "Lovely set of in-laws you got, mate." And then we see Abby go over to Dawn and she gives him a big hug and says, "Is it over? Is it really over?" And Dawn embraces her and says, "Yes, sweetheart. Everything's all right." And just as he says that, we cut to the outside of the Sunderland Corporation building and one of the floors in the middle explodes. And of course, this sends the whole building shaking. And I don't know which floors Swamp Thing and company are on, but both the floor and the ceiling begin to collapse around them. And John exclaims, "Bloody hell, what next?" Then we cut to down the hall where Connie Sunderland is either dead or passed out, as the monster that attacked her looks up questioningly because the building begins to fall apart around it. And then out of nowhere, he's struck by a purple hand, which I guess knocks him out. And then we see Dr. Polygon take the body of Connie and presumably run down the stairs and out of the building. Then we cut to Swamp Thing and company, and they are also running down the stairs out of the building, and Swamp Thing is yelling to them, "Everybody, get out of the building!" And then in Hollywood fashion, just as they get out of the doors, the whole building comes down, toppling behind them in a fiery explosion, and they just barely make it out. But not everybody's unscathed. Unfortunately, Abby is hit by some debris in the back of the head, and she falls down. And Swamp Thing yells out, "Abby!" And as they look at Abby's body on the ground, Dawn says, "Oh my God, Abby, is she dead?" And John looks at Abby and says, "No, but it looks like she might be in some sort of coma." But then little baby Tefe walks over to her and she touches her face and says, Mommy, wake up." And Tefe actually touched the disfigured part of Abby's face. And when she did this, she must have used some kind of magic. And as she touches her mother's face, the entire half of Abby's body that was deformed by Anton Arcane repairs itself and she looks normal again. And then she also wakes up and she says, "Tefe?" And then we see the vision of Tefe that Abby sees. And there's all these little green orbs of magic floating around Tefe's new face. And if you remember, Abby has not seen Tefe's new face. So Tefe says to her, "Hi, Mommy." But Abby is freaked out for a second and she sits up and says, "Dear God, Tefe." And then Tefe is shocked by her reaction. So she actually runs over to Lady Jane and hugs onto her skirts. And Abby sees this and does not like it. And she points at Lady Jane and says, "This is your doing, I can tell. What have you done to my baby?" And Dawn cuts in saying, "Abby, try to calm down." But she gets super angry and says, "Don't tell me to calm down. Not after what that witch has done. She's taken away my daughter and replaced her with this thing. That's not Tefe. It's not my little girl. It's some kind of changeling." Then Swamp Thing comes over and he says, "Abby, that's enough. You're frightening your child." And Abby heard that. Swamp Thing just said yours instead of ours. And she yells back to him, "She's as much my child as you're my husband." I guess meaning that Swamp Thing isn't her husband anymore. And this version of Tefe, she doesn't believe is her daughter. So before Swamp Thing can answer back to her, John cuts in and says to Swamp Thing, "Beg pardon. Look, I know it's none of me business, and you could tell me to piss off if you'd like, but I wouldn't push things with the missus right now if I was you. She's been through hell, to put it mildly. There's a limit to what the human mind can stand, and I'm willing to bet she's reached it. She needs a rest, mate, in order to sort things out for herself. Given time, she'll come back around and accept the tyke as her own. And if she doesn't, well, there's no helping that, is there?" And while John was saying this, Abby kind of looked like she was falling faint, so Don has pulled her into his arms, and he looks up at Swamp Thing and says, "I think I can get the murder charges against her dropped. My family has enough clout to take care of that. I'll look after her, I promise." And we get this great panel of this hulking mass of Swamp Thing hovering over Dawn, looking very angry, actually. But then Swamp Thing snaps out of that and says, "Perhaps this is for the best. Take her with you. Make sure she receives the help she needs." And then Dawn puts his trench coat around Abby and they walk away, and Dawn yells back to him, "You won't regret this, I promise you. I'll see that she gets the best care available. Believe me, I want to help her any way I can." And as Abby and Dawn walk away, John and Swamp Thing look after them, and John turns to Swamp Thing and says, "Love sucks, doesn't it?" Then we cut to another area outside of the burning building, and we see Connie Sunderland is on the ground and she's beginning to wake up. And as she opens her eyes, she sees a bunch of purple faces hovering over her, and she yells out, "Get away from me! Get back!" But then she realizes it's just Polygon, and she says, "Oh, Polygon! Thank God it's you! Polygon! Brave, loyal Polygon! It was you who saved me, wasn't it?" And as she says this last line, she kind of sits up and touches her hand to one of his chins. And Polygon, of course, smiles, and then he turns around and points to the burning rubble behind him and says, "Look, Miss Sunderland, your beautiful building is burning." And then the other heads on Polygon say, "Fire, fire! Ashes, ashes! We all fall down! Ladybug, ladybug, fly away home!" But as Connie looks at the wreckage, she just smiles and says, "There's no need to worry, sweet Polygon. There will be time to rebuild, and the Sunderland Corporation will arise from the ashes stronger than ever. And then we will once more wreak vengeance on our enemies. Doesn't that sound nice, Polygon?" And as Polygon picks up the corpse head of General Sunderland, he says, "Yes, Miss Sunderland." And then she reaches out and puts a hand on his shoulder and says, "Polygon, you may call me Connie." Then we cut to Terrebonne Parish in Louisiana, back to Swamp Thing's house, where him and Lady Jane are watching Tefe play on a swing set that he has grown. And we don't really know how long it's been since the building collapsed and everything, but Tefe is wearing a different dress than she was before, and she's saying to Swamp Thing, "Daddy, swing me on the swing." And Swamp Thing says to her, "I'll be there in a moment." And we also see that Swamp Thing has kept his old body, so he doesn't have like the spikes and stuff, but he has kept the hair from his grunge days. So I guess he's keeping this long hair for now. And as Swamp Thing watches Tefe play, he smiles to himself and he says to Lady Jane, "Tefe seems to be taking everything that's happened in stride, at least on the surface." And Lady Jane replies, "She is a sapling. Her extreme youth and suppleness allows her to weather conditions that would snap a larger, older tree into kindling." And then Swamp Thing looks at her and says, "You speak as if she is a plant instead of a human child." And Lady Jane replies, "She is not human. I thought that would be obvious by now." Then we cut to a panel where we see Tefe's face is still changed, and she still has the lock of green hair in her white hair. And she's getting impatient, and she's saying, "Daddy, swing me now." So Swamp Thing ends the conversation with Lady Jane, and he walks over to Tefe and he says, "Hold on, sweetheart, Daddy's coming." And as Swamp Thing pushes Tefe on the swing, Lady Jane leaves them to go attend to some plants that are in the newly built house. And one of the plants says to her, "Lady, he must be told." And it seems like she knew this was going to happen because she looks down at the plant, not really surprised, and says, "I know, but what I must say is not easy." And the plant replies to her, "Be that as it may, you cannot delay much longer. If you wish to atone for your transgression, you must do as the Parliament decides. Which shall it be? Will you return to us or face eternity as an exile?" And we see Lady Jane ponder this ultimatum. Then we cut back to Swamp Thing, who's pushing Tefe on the swing, and he's thinking, "Things will be so different now that Abby's gone. I knew there would be a time when she would no longer be beside me, but I never dreamed she would leave of her own accord. I was prepared to grieve for the loss of her life, but not the death of our marriage. It's my fault it's come to this. I expected too much from her. No woman, no matter how resilient, could be expected to endure all that's happened recently and emerge unscathed mentally and emotionally. Our life together was never normal. Granted, there were times of relative peace, but there was always something lurking somewhere in the shadows to disrupt our happiness. I should count myself lucky. I have experienced what many true humans will never know, the sublime joy of genuine true love, and the pain that accompanies its end. Although Abby is gone, I still have Tefe, the living embodiment of our love. As long as she is here, Abby will never be far from my heart. And just as he thinks that last line, Lady Jane appears and says, Prime Founder, there is something I must say. So Swamp Thing stops pushing Tefe and he goes over to Lady Jane and he reaches out to move some vine hair out of her face and he says, Lady, after what we have gone through together, must you be so formal? Call me Alec. But she pulls away from him and says, No, that is what your wife called you, and I am not your wife. Then she turns her back to him and says, Prime Founder, what we did was wrong. It went against every rule laid down by the Parliament. Because of our foolishness, there will be repercussions both inside and outside the Green for months to come, both foreseen and unexpected. And Swamp Thing's a little confused because he thought, they were lovers or whatever. And he says, What are you saying? That what happened between us meant nothing to you? And then she turns to him angrily and says, I'm saying that it meant too much. Prime Founder, there is no room for love between elementals. There can never be. What would happen to the Green should its protectors place their personal happiness above its concerns? I thought that living in the swamp away from the world of humans would keep me safe from them. I believed it possible to return to the mortal world in order to tutor your successor in the ways of the Green, but now I realize that it is impossible. No matter how hard I try, humans continue to intrude, their influence corrupting not only Tefe, but myself as well. If I remain here any longer, I risk the run of being permanently tainted. If I wish to resume my place amongst the Parliament, I cannot allow myself the folly of pretending to be human. And as she's saying this, she does have her back to Swamp Thing, and you can see her face is of anguish, like she doesn't really want to make this decision. And Swamp Thing says to her, Lady, what are you saying? And Lady Jane turns to him, and she's got tears in her eyes, and she says, It's time for me to leave. And then Swamp Thing goes all aggro, and he grabs her by her arms, and he lifts her up kind of off the ground a little bit, and he says, No, you can't go. I won't let you. But Lady Jane shirks and breaks free of his grasp and says, I'm afraid you have nothing to say in the matter. The Parliament has spoken. I have heard. Nothing else matters. And then Swamp Thing points to Tefe, who is now paying attention to them, and stops swinging. And he says, What about Tefe? Isn't it bad enough her own mother has rejected her? Must you leave her too? And then Lady Jane kind of looks angry, and she looks at Swamp Thing and says, I did not say I would return to the Parliament alone. And Swamp Thing looks shocked at this, and he says, What? And then Lady Jane steps back and points at Swamp Thing and says, If Tefe is to assume the mantle of the Green's protector, she herself must be protected as well. Every previous elemental in Earth's history was created full-blown, capable of defending itself from the moment of its inception if need be. Tefe, however, came into the world a human infant. She has neither the stamina nor the life experience to function as a proper elemental. If she is to understand and harness her unique powers, she must undergo rigorous tutoring without fear of interruption or danger. Obviously, that cannot be found here. Tefe's only hope lies in coming with me to the Parliament. And Swamp Thing does not like the sound of that, and he yells out, No! But Lady Jane doesn't pay any attention to him, and she begins to walk over to Tefe and says, You have no say in the matter, Prime Founder. And Swamp Thing replies, She's my daughter, damn it. And then Lady Jane turns to him with anger in her eyes and says, While you may have been instrumental in Tefe's conception, she belongs to the Green, not you. And then she walks over to Tefe and picks her up and says, Come, Tefe, it's time to go. Tell your father goodbye. And without a tear in her eye, Tefe looks at Swamp Thing and says, Bye-bye, Daddy. And as Swamp Thing yells, Tefe, don't leave me! The bodies of Lady Jane and Tefe burst as they go into the Green, and we see Tefe's little bones fall down to the ground, and also Lady Jane's vines fall into a pile on the ground as well. And as we turn to the last page of Nancy Collins' run, we see Swamp Thing on his knees crying as he holds the bones and entrails of Tefe's body. And we're left with him saying one word that finishes what he was yelling as he said, Tefe, don't leave me. He cries, Alone. And that, my friends, is the end of the Nancy Collins run and the end of that issue. And boy, was that an ending, I gotta say. I never knew what was going to happen at any point in that story arc, and I never would have guessed that it's going to end with Swamp Thing being left alone and Abby leaving him for one of Constantine's friends, and then also Tefe being taken to the Green. But we'll have to see what happens with those plot threads with the next creative team. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, feel free to email me at planestrains.and-comicbooks, all one word, @gmail.com. And remember, until next time, stay swampy.